Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'd like to welcome you to our Zoom land meeting today called Deforestation in the Time of COVID. It's co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Brazil, Latin America, and Environmental Change and Security Program. And let's get off here. Now, the production of agricultural commodities is the main driver of deforestation around the world. And while COVID-19 has brought what appears to be the whole world to a standstill, the pandemic has actually served to accelerate commodity-driven deforestation. The problem is particularly severe in Brazil, where a weakening of law enforcement and continued international demand for agricultural commodities, led by China, EU, and the US, are driving the rapid destruction of Amazon rainforest. Today, I've got 5 great people who are going to tell us some very sobering stories, but also they've promised me we also have some hopeful ideas and action on solutions. And to start out with, we're going to have Paula Bernasconi from the Instituto Centro de Vida, who is going to share some stories about the skyrocketing deforestation from soy and beef production in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. And then following her, we have André Vasconcelos of Global Canopy, who's going to introduce a deforestation risk assessment tool, to promote transparency about what's happening on the ground. And he's going to talk about the links between Brazil's deforestation and trade with EU and China. And so that's going to set the foundation of the scope of the problem and what's happening. And then we're going to switch over to 1, 2, 3 quick comments on solutions and actions happening in the policy realm. We have Rick Jacobsen from the Environmental Investigation Agency, and he's going to discuss US imports of agricultural products associated with deforestation and give us an overview of policy and regulatory responses in consumer markets. And then Kevin Stockert from the US Representative Blumenauer's office will discuss legislative measures that Congress is developing right now to address the role of trade in driving deforestation in Brazil and other countries. And closing us out today, but there's still going to be Q&A, don't forget that. We have Giuliana Torta, the EU delegation to the United States. She's going to talk about steps underway in Europe to establish new policies and regulations to reduce the bloc's deforestation footprint globally. So again, start out kind of gloomy, hopefully end up a little more optimistic. Now, if you look at the webinar screen, you'll see at the bottom that there are Twitter, Facebook, and emails to submit questions. Please start submitting them at any time, but I'll be asking them at the end. So to start off with, I'm going to ask Paula to share your screen and show us some pictures and tell us some stories. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you see my screen? And can you hear me?
Yes, we can see your pictures and we can hear you beautifully.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jennifer and the Wilson Center for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in such an important discussion today. And I will speak about some of the challenges of deforestation in Brazil, focusing on the state of Mato Grosso. And we will show some characteristics of the deforestation that I hope can contribute to bring some insights on opportunities to how global markets can contribute to that. And I will start talking about very quickly why deforestation matters to the world. So as you all know, we're living under a climate emergency with growing consequences worldwide. And according to the Global Forest Watch, emissions from tropical deforestation are equivalent to the annual emissions of 400 million cars. And if tropical deforestation were a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter globally, ranking just below the US and even higher than the whole European Union. So this map here shows wildfires that are happening this month in Brazil and how they are producing a plume of carbon monoxide that is spreading as far as East Australia. And even if the smoke can be seen, the particles are in the air. So forests have a central role in climate change, and Brazil is a key player since it's responsible alone for 1/3 of all this deforestation. For those who are not familiar with Brazilian history, it's hard to believe, but the scenario has been worse. In the early 2000s, Amazon deforestation achieved its peak with almost 28,000 square kilometers. Then we had around a decade of reduction, and we achieved the lowest rate in 2012. But since then, deforestation have been increasing again and got totally out of control, soaring by 34% last year. And the preliminary official data shows a trend to a similar increase this year. Mato Grosso is the key state for Brazil's agribusiness economy. It produces nearly 1/3 of all Brazilian soy, with a crop area bigger than Portugal, and produces around 32 million tons of soy, and most of it is shipped to international markets. And it's also the largest beef producer, with more than 30 million heads of cattle. And it's very representative of the challenges that the whole Amazon region faces, since it's also home of 90 indigenous lands and 100,000 family farms. And it has also still around 60% of the territory preserved, an area bigger than France of natural vegetation. So the result of this combination is that the deforestation rates in Mato Grosso follow a similar trend to the one I showed the rest of the Amazon. And for many years, the increase in deforestation rates was totally linked to increase in soy and beef production. Here you can see in the graph in red and yellow. But from 2005 and beyond, it has decoupled, and proving that there's no need of new deforestation to continue increasing the commodities production. And also that eliminating deforestation doesn't harm the economy, as some people argue. But deforestation is not just chopping trees. The fastest and cheapest way to clean the area after deforestation is to set fire in the remaining trees. And in regular conditions, the forest around is humid enough to prevent the fires to spread. But with climate change and degradation, this resistance is broken, and the fires get out of control. The fires produce air pollution that is especially harmful to vulnerable people. And a joint report by Human Rights Watch and IPAN, released this week, found that fires in the Brazilian Amazon last year caused a high negative impact on public health and exposed 4.5 million people that live in the Amazon to levels of particulates higher than those recommended by the World Health Organization. And this toxic haze caused over 2,000 additional hospitalizations due to respiratory illness attributable to the fires. We still don't have studies with the impact of this year with COVID and the new fires, but specialist says the health impacts of fires could be even worse, as the medical facilities are already strained and could, lead to a new collapse of the health system in some parts of the Amazon. So how to revert the trend and reduce deforestation? As I showed on the previous graphs, Brazil already succeeded in the past with using strong enforcement of public policies, command and control actions, credit restriction to farms, for example, strategic actions focusing in priority municipalities. But it was also very important the role of markets and supply chain, with the creation of the soy moratorium, the beef agreements to zero deforestation, and many supply chain government commitments bringing international pressure to Brazil, such as the Consumer Goods Forum Resolution, New York Declaration of Forests, and many other individual corporate commitments from retailers, for example. However, in the last years, we have seen a dismantling these agencies responsible for environmental protection and law enforcement in Brazil, recurrent attacks in the legislation, promises to open protected areas and indigenous lands for mining and agriculture, and deforestation rates reacted to that and increased a lot. Early this month, more than 60 civil society organizations in Brazil, including ICV, presented both houses of the Congress a proposal of 5 emergency measures against the environmental crisis, including a 5-year moratorium on deforestation and also harsher punishment for environmental crimes such as land grabbing. So society knows what is needed to be done, and it has been done before in the past by Brazil, but what we see is a clear lack of political will. And also on the private side, the failure to galvanize meaningful action from all those major companies, investors, and government that sign up to ambitious goals to end deforestation, their supply chains, also preventing the necessary sector-wide change. we see that commitments are not enough anymore, and if they are not implemented seriously and urgently. But going back to the characteristics of deforestation, some people claim that deforestation is caused by smallholders and indigenous people for its subsistence. So I brought some numbers from ICV's studies in the last years to show how the majority of the deforestation looks like in Mato Grosso, in the Amazon and Cerrado. And in general, what we see is that 60% of the deforestation occurs in farms that are registered in the CAR. That is the Environmental Rural Register in Brazil. And it means that the government has all the data from those farmers. And also 60% of the deforestation in those farms happens in large farmers that have an area of over 1,500 hectares. And besides that, the size of the polygons of the deforestation are mostly larger than 50 hectares each in a single year. And as studies estimate the cost of deforestation in around R1,000 per hectare, those big deforestations are only possible to perform with high investment and also a certainty of impunity. So it's clearly part of a business investment of capitalized farmers. It's not at all small farmers and indigenous people. And another concerning characteristic of deforestation is the illegality. The Brazilian Forest Code allows farmers to cut legally a percentage of the forest, but the majority of the deforestation do not have a permit issued by agencies, so it's illegal. In Mato Grosso, between 2012 and 2017, only 3% of all deforestation that happened was legal. And it's very concerning because in our study with Trace and Imaflora on soy and deforestation, we saw that over 1/4 of this illegal deforestation took place on soy farms. And over 80% of the soy produced on these farms was exported to global markets. For example, 46% to China and 14% to EU. The very high illegality also shows that, considering the difficulties in order to access legality and the urgency of eliminating deforestation, the best policy or commitment for any market or company who really wants to implement it is zero deforestation, not zero illegal deforestation, as it reduces a lot the struggles in implementation and the difference in area is very marginal. So finally, to close with some good news, the study I mentioned on soy and Mato Grosso also showed that deforestation is highly concentrated, that only 2% of the soy farmers concentrates 80% of illegal deforestation in the period. And other studies also found the same trend. Rajon and colleagues published at the Science magazine. They also find 2% of all farms in Amazon and Cerrado are responsible for 60% of all potential illegal deforestation. And another study by the Forest Code Observatory, that's a Brazilian network of NGOs, estimated that only 4% of all Brazilian farms are not compliant with the legal reserve requirements. So the concentration shows how urgent it is to solve the issue, since the image of all Brazil's agribusiness is at stake because of only few farmers, and they are the rotten apples of agribusiness, as Rajon named it in his study. And because of them, retailers are threatening to boycott Brazilian products, and some of the world's biggest investment funds are on the verge of divesting from Brazil. And if it happens, it could intensify the current economic crisis and threaten jobs, aggravating the country's inequality and poverty. So we need to act. And the deforestation problem is huge, but the concentration means that it's not too difficult to address by both government with strategic enforcement actions, and also by markets and traders with supply chain monitoring and control. So with that, I pass to my other colleagues to discuss more about the external market links of deforestation, and I'm available for discussion next. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So horrific problem, but I like that you've given us a path that we can target solutions in a certain way. But to target solutions, you have to really see where the problems are. So André, tell us your story about your transparency work.
Great, I will just share my screen quickly here with you guys. Yeah, so thanks Jennifer, and good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, for all of you. And thanks Paula for nicely setting up the stage for our discussion here about deforestation. I wanted to follow up after this great presentation from Paula talking about how deforestation is actually linked with these global supply chains, and then present a little bit of this platform called TRACE that assess the exposure of global supply chains to this deforestation. But first, I think a key piece of the puzzle for us to be able to address these issues around deforestation is actually to understand what's driving deforestation. And in the tropical areas, we know that most of the deforestation is actually driven by the agriculture expansion, in particular by commodities or by the so-called soft commodities, which includes cattle and soy, which are the major drivers of deforestation in South America in general, palm oil, which is a major deforestation in Southeast Asia, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia, and then timber products in general. I mean, it's important to mention that these commodities are extremely important for our economy. I mean, these commodities are mostly produced in the tropical regions where it's driving deforestation, but then they're exported to many, many countries all over the world. And then they are, we can see them in shelves of supermarkets in different countries. So as when we take into account that the demand for these commodities, which are driving deforestation and also all the environmental impacts in the tropical areas, is global, and the deforestation impacts are also global, including biodiversity loss, but also the climate change, right? Then we need to take into consideration that the responsibilities for addressing this problem of deforestation should be shared across the many actors, in the supply chains. But I think the main problem that we face here is that the supply chains are extremely complex and opaque. So, for example, how can we understand the risks of deforestation associated with the soy produced in the Northeast, and how is this connected to China, US, or Europe? So before, we had great information from resources trade, for example, that map these flows, these exports from the producing countries to the consuming countries. But here there is a gap that we needed to address to be able to assess this global market's exposure to deforestation, right? So the first one is actually where exactly these commodities are produced. Because once we understand, the production regions, then we can start linking to environmental impacts and social impacts, right? And the second one is, which are the traders, which are the companies that are handling these flows and are exporting these commodities, these forest risk commodities from tropical countries to all around the world. So that's exactly what we wanted to address, what we aim to address with Trace data and with the Trace platform. So Trace is a science-based initiative that aims to improve transparency of the supply chains of these commodities. And at the core of our strategy is to actually link these production landscapes with the countries where they are going to. And then with one click, for example, we can see, for example, Cargill, where they sourced their soy from in Brazil in 2018, and then where this soy actually was exported to all countries that they went to. And we can do the same for example, for European Union. And then we click, and then we see all the companies exporting soy from Brazil to European Union, and all the companies that are involved in this trade. And again, once we understand these connections from production regions to global markets, then we can associate deforestation risk, right? We can assess that. And in Trace, we created what we call deforestation risk. In this case, soy deforestation risk. So again, clicking again into one company, we can assess we can understand the deforestation risk or the exposure that this company is to deforestation. We can see which are the markets exposed, but we can see also where are the links or where are the places where this company is most exposed to deforestation risk in a quantitative way. But actually, what can we do with this data? So I brought here one example of all China soy imports from Brazil in 2018. And if we look at in detail, we see that about 35% or 1/3 of all the exports, soy exports from Brazil to China came from the south region of Brazil, which is actually far away from the deforestation frontiers, and therefore there is a really low deforestation risk. In contrast, we see this area here in red, well known as Mato Piba, that of all the exports from Brazil, the soy exports from Brazil to China, this region accounted for 9% of the volume, but it corresponds for 80% of the deforestation risk. So the risk is highly concentrated in particular places. And then if we want to take one step further, then we can look at the companies, which are the companies trading these commodities, right? Then we can advise, for example, China and the buyers to engage with these companies. And in this case, we see that only 5 companies highlighted here in red, they accounted for 75% of all the exports from Mato Piba to China. And if we go to a more granular, analysis, we see that this, and go to a municipality level, for example, or to a regional level, we see that about 50% of the deforestation driven by soy and cattle in Brazil and in South America, they actually is concentrated in less than 15% of the places where these commodities are produced. And in terms of the association with exports, we see that this is even more concentrated. For example, here in Brazil, for Brazilian soy, this chart here, the gray part, it's a representation of all the places, all the municipalities where soy is produced. But we see that only 1% of the places where the soy is produced account for more than 50% of the deforestation associated with exports in 2018. And it's really similar for Brazilian beef. So 2% of the beef producing municipalities accounted for more than 50% of the deforestation associated with cattle or beef exports from Brazil in 2017. And this pattern holds for many other commodities and many other countries across South America. And then when we look at the market share, we also see that a few companies are handling most of their exports. In the case of the Brazilian soy, only 5 companies accounted for 56% of all the exports from Brazil to all over the globe. In the case of the Brazilian beef, it's even more concentrated in the hands of a handful of companies. So 5 traders accounted for 76% of all the exports from Brazil to global markets. And what I wanted to bring here to the discussions is, first, I wanted to highlight the importance of the consumer markets in this journey towards a more sustainable supply chain. And for that, we need a collaborative effort from consumer markets, from the buyers, together with the producing countries, to address this complex problem. And the second message that I wanted to pass to everyone here is that the concentration of the risk, echoing what Paula has just said, and what I bring here with this analysis, it actually provides an opportunity for the global markets, for the buyers to start addressing this problem, right? So targeting action in these high-risk areas, engaging with the companies that are handling most of the commodities, we can then drive a huge impact. So I just want to wrap up, and those are the messages that I wanted to bring here. And I really look forward to our discussion and our Q&A session after. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Again, we have a similar pattern: horrible numbers, reasons for optimism. All right, so Rick, Kevin, and Giuliana, you have to kind of keep that little bit of optimism thing going for us here today. So Rick, can you do it? You're gonna talk to us a little bit about the US markets and how are we involved in this? What can we do?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to Wilson Center for having us. So I'll be talking mostly about the negative, but just start to dip my foot into the positive at the end. So I'll just share my screen here. And what I wanted to do was take a step back from the Brazil case that we've learned a lot about and look at the global picture a bit in terms of the relationship between agricultural commodities and deforestation. I will not waste my valuable time getting into what EIA is exactly, but I understand these slides will be up on the Wilson Center website later. We're a DC-based NGO that focuses especially on environmental crime. As I mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of global deforestation and its drivers with a focus on agricultural commodities, which account for an estimated 80% of forest conversion in the world. And then I'm going to present some results that EIA has been working on, specifically focused on US imports of products and commodities linked to deforestation. And then I'll just touch briefly on some of the precedents and recent developments in consumer markets to try to help address the problem of human rights abuses, environmental harms in global supply chains. So just to look broadly at tree cover loss, this is data from 2019 showing we're highlighting the top 10 countries where tree cover loss is a problem in the tropical zone. We have left out some of the temperate zone data for reasons I'll explain in a bit. And in general, we've included tree cover loss data color-coded by country in the tropical regions. Just to highlight, as has been mentioned, Brazil plays a huge role with a quarter of all the tree cover loss in 2019. So in terms of what's causing the tree cover loss, this is data from a recent study published by the World Resources Institute and the Sustainability Consortium, where they tried to analyze what was behind the deforestation in different regions. And the points to highlight here are that in Latin America and Southeast Asia, commodity-driven deforestation, which is permanent conversion of forest to what is usually large-scale agriculture, is the majority driver. And in other regions, especially in temperate zones, you tend to see forestry causing tree cover loss, and a lot of times that's not a permanent conversion, and there's no agriculture or international trade involved beyond timber. And I should point out, fires are also a big part of the problem when it comes to tree cover loss. So just a very, this has already been mentioned by André, but just to give a sense of some of the main drivers, so the commodities drivers of deforestation. So just a handful of agricultural commodities are really responsible for the vast majority of deforestation in the tropics. And I will now just go through, just to give a snapshot of some of the trade flows that matter most, just so we can get a sense of which consumer markets are receiving a lot of the goods that are produced linked to this deforestation. So just starting with Brazil, I think this has already been mentioned, and you know, these are very top line numbers based on UN Comtrade data. So the data that Trace is making available on these same trade flows is much more detailed as we've seen. But it shows how soy and cattle products, beef and hides, are the main exports linked to deforestation from Brazil. And just to, in Africa, we're seeing that timber is a major issue, and I'll explain in a bit why timber hasn't been our focus right now. But cocoa in West Africa is generally considered an issue both for deforestation and also for labor abuses because of the prevalence of child labor in that production. Elsewhere, deforestation in Africa tends to be more related to local agriculture and doesn't have the same links to international markets as in other regions. This is Indonesia, where, as has been mentioned, palm oil is considered the biggest driver. Pulp is another one used for paper production, which is by far, where China is by far the biggest importer. And then rubber is also a driver, maybe maybe considered a second-tier driver compared to some of the other ones we've mentioned. And then just quickly, Malaysia, palm oil is a big issue. It is certainly not the only issue, but considered the major driver of deforestation there. In the Mekong countries, we're seeing the rise of industrial rubber plantations starting to displace forests. And the main destinations there are China and Vietnam, where it's used to produce a whole range of rubber products. So then just to focus in a little bit on the US, and what exposure the U.S. has to commodities and related products. EIA just analyzed UN Comtrade data, so official data, and here we just highlight the trade value of some of the raw commodities that are coming into the U.S. So you can see that the single largest one is actually rubber from Indonesia, with palm oil close behind. There's hides coming from Brazil, and just this year, fresh beef has started to come into the U.S. in larger quantities after a ban was lifted. U.S. is a major importer of cocoa, beef from Nicaragua, and so forth. And again, this is by no means an exhaustive list of what's linked to deforestation, but we wanted to highlight some of the major trade flows. And just to look at one extra step of complexity here. A lot of products, especially in the US, a lot of product imports are linked to deforestation indirectly because the raw materials are used for manufacturing in other countries. So we've highlighted a few examples. For example, chocolate from the EU. The EU is also sourcing its raw material, its cocoa from West Africa primarily. And tires are produced around the world, made from rubber, that some of which is originating from problematic places in Southeast Asia. And leather, of course, there's a lot of leather production and hide production outside of the tropical zone. But as we've seen, in Brazil, cattle is the largest driver of deforestation, and Brazil is actually the largest exporter of hides in the world, as well as beef. So now a flood of text, but I will just try, sorry, Jennifer, I will try to just quickly run through this. So I wanted to just touch on kind of the current state of play and some interesting precedents for regulating trade and when it comes to human rights and environmental issues. So as we've seen, the EU, US, and China are major importers of agricultural commodities and products linked to deforestation, but there are a lot of other countries involved as well. So we need to see leadership from these markets, but we also need to harness that towards a move towards global rules for legal and sustainable trade, which is certainly not the case right now. We've seen that voluntary corporate policies and certification schemes developed over the last decade have just simply not been enough by themselves to reduce deforestation and address human rights that may be associated with that, human rights abuses. So we think that consumer market regulations are essential, both to incentivize systemic change and also to level the playing field so that leading companies aren't putting themselves at major commercial risks necessarily by moving in front. We think that due diligence is a key element of these regulatory measures that are needed, and that, in a nutshell, is companies knowing where their stuff came from, their full supply chains, then gathering the information to assess any risks associated with that production and take measures to avoid the harms, and that may also involve just changing their supply chains if necessary. And then, of course, they need to report on what they're doing. The more transparency, the better. For timber, the reason timber hasn't been mentioned in my presentation a lot is we do have regulatory frameworks for addressing the trade in illegal timber. They've been around for a while now. The US put in place a law, or amended a law in 2008 that prohibits the import of illegal timber. And the EU did something that came into effect in 2013 similarly. And both of those laws do oblige companies to do some due diligence to understand where their stuff came from and mitigate that risk of illegality. And China just recently passed a new forest law, which prohibits the use of illegally sourced timber in China. but how this is going to apply to timber imports, because China is the largest importer of tropical wood, needs to be determined in implementing rules that are currently under development in China. And then I just wanted to mention briefly that the US and the EU already have a number of laws that oblige importers to carry out supply chain due diligence to ensure that the products they're sourcing are legal and don't involve certain human rights abuses. So 3 examples that I wanted to highlight are the EU conflict mineral regulation, which requires importers of certain minerals that are linked to armed conflict to carry out supply chain due diligence when they import those minerals into the EU. The US Tariff Act prohibits the import of any goods that were produced through forced labor. And recently, a certain loophole was removed in that law to allow greater enforcement. And we've seen in recent years an increase in enforcement of that provision. And then there are fishery laws in both the US and the EU that prohibit the trade in illegally harvested fish and require quite detailed traceability and reporting requirements for fish imports and fish placed on the markets. So I wanted to end by just touching on a few positive notes, recent new developments, and Kevin and Giuliana will be speaking more about what's happening to the EU and US, so I won't get into that in too much detail. But recently, the EU has been looking at its role in driving deforestation globally and has started a process to develop laws and policies to reduce its global footprint on forests. A coalition of NGOs and also a number of corporations have come out publicly to call on EU regulators to require companies to carry out due diligence, both on deforestation and also on human rights violations in their agricultural commodity supply chains. The UK just a few days ago announced its plans to develop a law that would prohibit agricultural commodities coming from illegally deforested land and also put due diligence obligations on importers. That's very early stages, and they've just started a consultation on that initiative. US lawmakers have also been recognizing the problem, and as Kevin will update us on some legislative measures that are in the works here. And then just briefly on China, we have seen some voluntary industry pronouncements lately, and there are a few non-binding government guidelines about agricultural commodity supply chains and trying to eliminate deforestation and in some cases human rights abuses in those supply chains. But as yet, we haven't seen the government announce or indicate an intent to develop specific policies around its agricultural commodity supply chains and its global forest footprint. So that is what I wanted to cover. I hope I managed to stay on time. And happy to answer questions later.
You did great, and it was really important. So now we've set the stage and we know what has happened before. Now we're gonna zip on over to Kevin to talk to us a little bit about what's happening up on the Hill in terms of this issue.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this important conversation. So as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Kevin Stockert. I serve as a senior legislative assistant to Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who sits on the Ways and Means Committee, which covers trade issues and represents Portland, Oregon. The congressman does, not the committee. So I'll start by giving a bit of history on one congressional attempt to curb international deforestation. The Lacey Act of 1900 is a federal law that prohibits trade in products illegally harvested in their country of origin. As Rick mentioned, this law was amended in 2008 through the Farm Bill to add wood and wood products. In the House, these efforts were led by my boss, Congressman Blumenauer. When we amended the Lacey Act in 2008, we worked with a broad coalition of timber interest consumers, importers, labor unions, and the environmental community during a Republican administration to prevent the importation of illegally harvested wood. The purpose was simple. It was to level the playing field and ensure that companies importing these products are playing by the rules. The Lacey Act amendments were passed after it became clear a legislative approach was needed to combat the black market and to protect the economy and the environment. The passage of the amendments was an illustration of US global leadership. As Rick mentioned, it spawned similar policies in the EU as well as in Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Mexico, all to crack down on illegal timber. In the 116th Congress, there is renewed interest in deforestation. Members and senators have taken notice of large companies like McDonald's and Unilever pledging to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. However, several reports from the NGO community have showed that these companies are falling behind on their pledges. Importantly, other governments like the EU and the UK are on the verge of acting. Another important note is that in June 2020, Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee, which oversees trade agreements, sent a letter to the US Trade Representative expressing opposition to any trade deal with Brazil. Deforestation was cited as a key concern by that committee. The letter effectively froze any agreement for the foreseeable future, all because of concerns over this issue. For future action, deforestation was spotlighted by the House Select Committee report on the climate crisis, which was released this summer. Page 446 of the report specifically recommends restricting access of commodities and products produced on illegally deforested land. So, what does this mean in terms of legislation? Well, Congressman Blumenauer, my boss, is working with Senator Brian Schatz, who represents Hawaii, on a legislative approach. We are noticing increased public awareness about the impacts of palm oil, beef, soy, and other commodities on habitat, indigenous lands, and the climate. We're also working to monitor the zero deforestation pledges of many companies, and we have a desire to buttress these efforts with legislation. We're concerned that goods produced on illegally deforested lands and imported in the United States create a market issue for US commodities, which are produced in strict adherence to US environmental regulations. Last year, our offices began work with the NGO community to understand the scope of this issue. We're using a similar approach to the Lacey Act amendments, which had a very thorough vetting process. That legislation had administration support and testimony, business input, and congressional hearings. There is a similar intent with this legislation, focused on commodities sourced from illegally deforested land. We're engaged in consultation with a variety of businesses that would be affected, and our intent is for this bill to be bipartisan. So, here's a brief outline of where we are so far. Our legislation hopes to be risk-based and to increase transparency in reporting in companies' international supply chains. Import declarations would be required for certain commodities which are determined to be at high risk of being grown on illegally deforested lands. This includes listing palm oil, soy, and beef products, and creating an interagency working group to make additional recommendations. International cooperation is key to this approach. Countries will be able to enter into an agreement with the United States to waive this requirement if they're able to demonstrate that they are committed to eliminating illegal deforestation. The US government will also offer foreign assistance to countries that are committed to eliminating illegal deforestation. There's a financial crimes component of the bill as well. We're going to include illegal deforestation as a specified unlawful activity so that it will be covered by RICO and money laundering cases. Public disclosure is also crucial. The bill will create SEC disclosure requirements related to deforestation risk by publicly traded companies. And there will be a procurement preference from the federal government for products that are certified to be deforestation free. Our goal is to create a whole of government approach. We're drawing for the expertise of various government agencies to curb deforestation abroad. Our hope is to unveil a form of legislation later this year, and we welcome discussion and public input. Thank you.
Cool. Good plan, good action. Hopefully move, and you're all doing it through Zoom meetings, obviously. Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Now let's probably also via Zoom meetings. We've got the folks in the EU also talking about this topic and where to take action. So Giuliana, tell us what's happening there. Bring our spirits back up again.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to the organizer and to my fellow panelists that provided so many very interesting information. I don't have a PowerPoint. I think I will circulate some slides at the end, so that's a reference for our public. Let me concentrate and start with the good news, because you have been asking for good news, Jennifer, since the beginning, so let me go with it, and then I become grimmer a bit later. So the good news is that in the EU now, environmental policies and the supply chain as well are at the center of attention. They are a top priority. They are very much part of the European Green Deal. You may have heard of that, and it's our growth strategy, but it is a very green growth strategy. So now we have 4 years to deliver on that and to set the basis for a new economy and hopefully a new society. So that's very good news. It is reflected in 2 strategies, which are also very recent, the Biodiversity Strategy 2030 and the Farm to Fork Strategy that covers the agricultural sector. And already last year in 2019, the EU relaunched the commitments on the issue of deforestation. As Rick has said very well, there is already legislation in the EU tackling illegality in the timber sector. It is called the EU Timber Regulation. It introduced due diligence. We have the FLAG action plan that has been there since 2003. So we have now 17 years of experience in implementing the FLAG action plan. And there you have some mechanisms that could be useful also for tackling deforestation and these issues of agricultural commodities. So we have a frame, a political frame and political commitment. And another very good news, in my opinion, is that we move away from the discussion, do we need more legislation on this? Because now the reply is, yes, what we have is not enough. We have been working a lot, many years, and if you go back in time, we have been discussing about deforestation since the 60s. So really, it is more than 60 years that we are discussing how to stop deforestation. It means probably most of our public was not even born. I wasn't born, so let's be clear. And we have to do something. We have to pool resources and we have to try to collaborate in a way that delivers. And we managed to find a solution to this incredibly complex problem. Because today we are discussing about some specific commodities, but there are many more. And there is a study in 2013, the European Commission published a study about our responsibility on deforestation. And if you look at the list of agricultural commodities and also other products that are in the list, it's amazing. In some cases, you can have also things like you wouldn't think about, like sugarcane, and things that are really small compared to beef and soy or timber, but they could contribute. And maybe they're not a major issue today, but they could become a big issue tomorrow or in 5 years' time. So we need to act together. The EU has a lot of commitments, has put a lot of resources, a lot of political capital in this, but we cannot work alone. So we really welcome these movements in the US to try to table new legislation. You know that our timber regulation to a large extent was expired by the amendment to the Lacey Act. So we keep track of each other and we try to exchange in the right moment to see how we can align our approaches. We need to bring our consumer blocks on board. And I'm thinking about China. This revision of the forest law in China is very good news. They don't have yet the implementing laws, so we will need to see what they put into it. We have the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the new COP coming up. You know that this was supposed to be the year of biodiversity in oceans. We are into COVID-19, so let's hope that next year we can achieve what the Paris Agreement has been for climate change. So that's the main target. And let's hope that at that stage, the EU and the US could announce something on deforestation, and China as well. You know that there is always this looking at each other also from other countries. And what's going on now in the EU? In very concrete terms, we are now in a phase which is called the impact assessment phase. It means we are assessing a number of options that could become legislation next year. What are these options? Some options are known. Rick has been mentioning that. Is due diligence the way to go for the agricultural commodities? It raised a number of questions. First, we need to see how the timber regulation has been performing, how the conflict minerals due regulation has been performing. We have this 17 years experience on the FLAG action plan and on what we call the voluntary partnership agreement, which are timber trade agreements. So we need to see and to build on the experiences there. Another idea could be, it was mentioned as well, we have legislation on fisheries. Could that be an inspiration also for covering agricultural commodities? It works in a different way compared to the timber regulation, but it could be something to look at. We have labeling, mandatory labeling. Could that be an option? We don't want to flood consumers with an incredible number of labels. There are already some on the market. It could become very confusing. So we need to be clear where to go if we go that way. And as I said, it's not a matter anymore to say, let's leave it to the voluntary schemes and to the voluntary action of the corporations. In Europe, we see that a number of multinationals and corporations come to us, come to the lawmakers asking to level the playing field. So it's not just a matter of the red tape imposed by a federal or a European entity. It's something that also is coming from people that are really very careful on what's happening on the markets, and they don't want to have to spend money if it is not worth it. And I don't know, Jennifer, I think I could stop here and then we give space to questions and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, well, no, that's great. I want to thank all of you for your great presentations. Because of a regional blackout on Zoom, this isn't live at the moment, so we didn't get outside questions, but I have a number and it also kind of opens up some, I mean, you all can be asking each other questions as well, but I'm gonna kick us off with a couple, and thank you that you did. One of my first questions, but maybe we'll go to that and then I'm gonna go to Paula. So Giuliana, you started listing, and Rick and Kevin did too, talk a little bit about some of the tools in our toolbox. And maybe if you could just give me, you talked about the mandatory labeling, but you also mentioned the fishery regulation and how that could be a model. Can you either give a little more detail on how, like what other tools we've worked before on kind of stemming, problem with environmental impact of trade that you think could be applicable here for the forests?
Is it to me or to?
It's to you, Giuliana. We'll start with you. Other?
I think we see, again, we are in an impact assessment phase, so I cannot tell you, if I could tell you, oh, that's the best solution, or we need a combination of solutions. In my view, it could be that we will end up with a combination of solution. We may need due diligence, but we may need a lot of education and campaigning. We may need also labeling. The IUU regulation works in a different way. So you have a definition of what is illegality. The advantage in the fishery sector is that they have very well agreed international definition. You know that in the forest sector, unfortunately, despite all these years, we don't even manage to have an agreement on what is sustainable forest management. You have different type of, and sometimes we also fight about the definition of forests, and we tend to change it. Look at the history of definition of forests in time, it changed over time. So that doesn't make life easy when you make the inventory. So in fisheries, they have this advantage, if you want. There is the law of the sea, and there is a definition. There are regional fisheries organization that they work and they define precise rules for fisheries and quota. What is interesting is that in the EU regulation is that you have 3 levels before suspending trade with a country which is exporting to the EU some illegal, and you have the proof of that. And this process of having 3 levels, so you have a red light, you have a yellow light, and you have a green light, it's a bit like kind of football match. When the country gets the yellow card, already you get in some kind of anxiety that lead the government to take action and to clean up a bit the things domestically. So you don't sometimes need to arrive to the red card and to stop trade. And this has proven to be quite powerful, and it could, and of course this goes hand in hand because we have been talking about what the consumer countries need to do, but the producer countries have a lot of responsibilities. So we need to help them and to work with them in partnership to build a better system. So it's always very important to have the 2 extremes, to work at the 2 extremes, the consuming side and the producing side.
Well, actually, I mean, and other people could jump in on the tool as well, but maybe first, just while I'm thinking of it, you said that word partnerships. Well, Kevin, the US Congress is working on this, the EU is working on it. Are you all I mean, I know you know each other, but is there some kind of coordination that the 2 EU and the US are kind of working together on this?
Yeah, absolutely. No, to an extent, Giuliana and I know each other from previous actual engagements, which is funny enough. And we, during that time, kind of got into talking about the history of the Lacey Act, both because of my boss's history and her actual own role working on it. So we started sharing information, and then as this opportunity arose and as we gained interest in it, and the EU did as well, we've kind of continued that work onto this side. So we've kept each other informed on what we're doing. I've actually shared draft bill text with Giuliana, for example, to make sure that she's aware of kind of the approach that we've been looking at right now. And it's not something that is new. It's something I think is exciting and helps us push each other to think differently about the problems that we're going to be facing, and understanding the fact that we have a lot of companies and large organizations that are working within both of our governments, and there needs to be a level of synergy between that in order for them to operate efficiently. So absolutely, I think it's a great relationship and something we're going to continue to be doing.
And Rick, did you want to jump in with a question or comment?
Yeah, I thought I could just mention a couple of the precedents from existing laws that we think that we've been looking to and thinking about. So one thing that's very important is traceability, as I mentioned, and we think that really ensuring that companies know where they source is kind of a prerequisite for any improvement in supply chain and sourcing. And that the traceability information should be reported. So others need to know about that, and enforcement officials in particular need to know about that in order to prioritize and monitor the situation. And similarly, as I mentioned, due diligence is critical. Traceability is a part of due diligence, but there's a lot more to it. And the more information that importers are providing to enforcement, the more enforcement has to work with in deciding how to make the law effective. And then in the case of the U.S. forced labor prohibition, there's a complaint mechanism that was established, or maybe I should call it a mechanism by which evidence can be provided to enforcement. And we think that's really critical. The EU timber regulation also has a slightly less formalized but still explicit a mechanism by which third parties and civil society can provide evidence to enforcement agencies to help them do their work. We think that a cross-commodity approach makes a lot of sense. Of course, every commodity supply chain has its unique features, but we think that there's a lot of similarities in terms of the due diligence processes that need to happen. And it would be better to get at all of these to develop these measures all at once. And then lastly, I think enforcement is critical. As we say, the bill needs to have teeth. Of course, we also want to see carrots, help being extended to trading partners. But if there isn't strong enforcement and dissuasive penalties, then it will be hard to change behavior. So we think, like with the Lacey Act, where we've seen some major cases brought forward by DOJ, and we've seen what an impact those have had down supply chains. We really need to see that level of enforcement and really effective penalties.
Thank you. And now, and the comment you made before talking about transparency and enforcement, of course, I have to turn to Paula and André to, so thinking about transparency, and maybe I'd like both Paula and André to talk a little bit more about the role that your organizations play. I mean, you're different. Like Paula, tell us just briefly, like your group, ICV, that what is it you're actually doing? Are you one of the rabble-rousers who are bringing groups together and might be able to make complaints? Are you working with international coalitions? Tell us a little bit more about what you envision, what you're doing and what could happen to really help make when this top-down stuff from EU and US and elsewhere happens.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, for the question. So we are an NGO based in Mato Grosso, so the state I talked about, and we have almost 30 years of experience working there, and we work in 4 different programs. The way we are organized, and we have both work in the ground with family farming production and support for like alternative ways of living without deforestation. So working with them on the field and helping. It's our program we call it social business. So it's pretty much linked to commercialization and linked to markets, but not international markets of commodities, but much more focused on local markets for fruits and forest products also. So we have this part of ICV that works with more on the field, and we also work developing what we call solutions. Our mission is developing shared solutions for sustainability. So part of our work is try to get solutions on the ground for commodities. So it's not just saying, for the cattle ranchers, you have to produce without deforestation, but we also try to to conduct pilots on the ground to try to find, economic viability of that. So we developed some years ago a program of sustainable cattle ranching with zero deforestation that was succeed a lot. So we showed that it is profitable to produce, when you invest in sustainable cattle ranching, and then it creates a spin-off, create a company that was a spin-off from ICV, that's an NGO. So it's also a really interesting story. And we also have the two other programs. Is one focused on transparency, that one of the things that is really important, is totally connected to this discussion, is in order for you to get, avoid deforestation and have governance and social accountability, is to have data. So we work with governments, especially more on the state level, but also in the federal level. So, and also in the Amazon level. So on try to get, key information and assessing the information, helping them to prioritize which data they should put online. So one of the examples is the deforestation permits. So Mato Grosso is the only state in all Brazil that has all this data available. So, companies and NGOs can access if it's legal or illegal deforestation. So this is just a basic example on how data is important. And this is a basic data that can be used through all worldwide, to cross with trade. Sorry, I muted. So to cross with EIA data. And so we have also this collaboration with other NGOs, like those two friends here, André and Rick, and we have do some work together. And also another program that works with economic incentives. So we try to find what we were calling the carrots, for the farmers that are doing the right thing. And for this, I think that this is the program that I coordinate, and one thing that is good, we work, for example, with REDD+, those forests, the deforestation policies. But I think that one of the best carrots that a farmer that are doing good can receive is to know that his neighbor that are doing, deforestation and illegal things is not competing for the same market with him. So, that's what's happening nowadays. So we always ask for carrots and, to premium prices and etc. But what we need is the basic thing is that, you don't have competing markets with legal and illegal and, deforestation and non-deforestation. That's what we have today. So very quickly and briefly, those are the areas we work, since on the ground, the field with farmers and small holders, but also finding these connections with international markets and REDD+ and all those carbon stuff.
Cool, I love it, from the grassroots up. So André, can you tell a little bit more about, I think some people, if they had been live, they would have said, so where does he get his data? How does this work? Can you tell us a little more about, like, where do you fit in? Because we've heard about what national EU and the US might be doing and other models. And the word transparency and due diligence keeps coming up. Are you part of this?
Yeah, no, for sure. Transparency is at the core of our work. And I really wanted to take one hook from what Paula just said, which is the importance of data. And really our role, we are a science-based initiative, and our role here is really to support Giuliana, to support Kevin, how they can address this problem. So we get all the data that is available, and we try to do the best that we can to improve transparency in those supply chains. So for example, we know with the data, we know that sourcing patterns matters, right? So first we need the traceability, basically. So what we use, connecting this data, connecting per shipment data, connecting public and official data, we first map the supply chains. I think this is the first step, right? And then another part of our work is to understand how these commodities are linked to deforestation on the ground. And then we connect all of this, and then we provide more transparency. And really, as I said, our role is to support consumer markets, is to provide key information and strategic information for consumer governments, consumer markets in general. And one example that I wanted to bring here that I think is quite relevant for the discussion is that what the French government, a couple of years ago, they released this national strategy on trying to tackle deforestation imported or associated with their imports, and they are working with the private sector and working groups like with the civil society, and we are trying to support them with data. So where actually the soy or the beef or the palm oil that France is consuming is coming from, and where are the high risk areas that they are, that they should be looking at. So really providing data to help support the consumers to prioritize actions to optimize resources and time.
And it is, I mean, I know that the EU and US are working on things, but you guys, the policies aren't in place yet. But I'm wondering, André and Paula, with the work that you're doing, I mean, you guys both mentioned that there's something like 5 companies, international companies are really responsible for the lion's share. Is the NGO coalition, Global Canopy, are you guys talking to these industries? Are they picking up the phone and answering your calls?
I don't know if you want to start, Paula. I can just quickly highlighting this. I mean, for example, the so-called ABCD, they handle, which is ADM, Bunge, Caju, and Luis Dreyfus, they handle more than 60% of the soy exports from Brazil. So they are really, key actors that should be engaged, and they already have commitments on zero deforestation. So they already take a step forward, which is amazing, and I think is the first and critical step. But now I think is about the implementation. How can we all work together to make sure these companies are enabled and have the data to implement this challenge really, and the commitments.
Yeah, so in Mato Grosso, we have some companies that are based there. For example, Amagi, and ICV is part of a strategy launched in the COPY in 2015 by the government of Mato Grosso that gets together governments, civil society, and companies. So we have been discussing and with them, we have several targets, including reducing deforestation. So we have a good relationship and a good dialogue on that, trying to create solutions. And also in the federal level, we are part of the Brazil Coalition of Climate, Forest and Agriculture, which is a huge coalition also of the big companies and a lot of NGOs that are trying to create the resolutions and positions, ensure that we can work together. We have a common interest to move on Brazil to a more sustainable economy and production. But I think one of the key points that we keep listening from those big companies is that they say, okay, we are we are highlighted, we are but we alone we won't solve the problem. We need really a sector-wide change. So then I agree with Giuliana just said that the importance for the regulation, and both from the external market and also from the federal level, because single companies, they can do their parts, they are really important and they have a power, but what they claim is that they can stop buying from some supplier, but their competitors, they will buy that production will end in Europe and US somehow. So that's why we need, a much more thing than what we have been doing so far. But yeah, we have been talking with them a lot and, trying to find solutions together.
So you're really seeing that there has to be something more international. Maybe I want to open up, Rick, do you want to ask a question of your colleagues or make some more comments? I'm going to open up the floor, because you guys, I mean, you know each other, but here's an opportunity. Maybe put him in the hot seat for a moment if you want.
Wow, okay. That's pretty.
Well, not just you. It could be. André had kind of a little look in his eye, like it's like, I have an idea.
I mean, one question that I could ask, which is kind of connected to the first question you asked, Jennifer, is when you asked if Giuliana, Kevin are talking and sharing experiences, I wanted to ask if you guys are also in touch with producing countries and how you see the importance of the producing countries or their role in this process.
I start, or Kevin?
Yeah, Giuliana, go ahead.
Absolutely, we are in contact with the producing countries. Now, Brazil is not an easy case, as you can imagine. Let's say the political situation is not really conducive to new announcement for deforestation, but it is part of the diplomacy that the EU has, and like with China, we have high level bilateral, and we have a specific one on forests. So that helped, but also with African countries, with Asian and Latin American countries. So absolutely, it's part of our development cooperation when the country is in development, and it's part of the diplomacy run by our External Action Service, and Borrell, our Secretary of State, if it is a developed economy.
Kevin?
Yeah, thanks. So I do want to highlight, obviously, working in the House of Representatives, we're not the diplomatic arm of the United States. That is a role served both by the United States Senate, the State Department. That said, we have had visits from the Brazilian embassy, for example, to talk about, that letter that the Ways and Means Committee, sent to USTR's office. We're also talking a lot to, the companies that are actually importing these products to talk about their supply chains. And André, it's one of the things I thought was so interesting about your presentation is we get a lot of mixed messages from them. Some of them, will say they have a keen understanding of their supply chain, what's going on. Some of them say that data is a little bit hard to gather. It's a really complicated problem, to face there. But it's absolutely something as we continue to work on the legislation that we're going to be doing. We're just still kind of in the inception process.
Rick, you're going to jump in there?
Well, my question's partially been answered. It would have been what avenues we have to try to bring China along in all of this, given that as the trade data I showed, really makes clear China is the biggest importer of many of these commodities that are driving deforestation.
Well, but but maybe for Rick and André, when we think about data, China is not known for often being super transparent, but have you had difficulty in getting, your charts looked amazing, André, but have you had difficulty in getting either information related to the imports into China or other types of data? Because I'm not questioning what you're doing because it looks really amazing, but and if you're having difficulty with data, how do you think you could correct it?
This is an amazing question, and I wanted to provoke it a little bit, okay. The EU in this case. So China, because part of the data that we use is exports and imports data, and we need to purchase or acquire this data, and the government from the countries need to allow people or organizations to purchase that data. And China, we can get that data. We have this data with us, which really helps to improve the model. But in case of the EU, we don't have access to the imports into EU. We only have the exports from Brazil and the other producing countries. So it's really important, for example, that the European Union could bring to the table if there is a possibility to make this data available. So that's just a quick provocation.
And just to add, from the US perspective, you can also get that data here in a lot of detail. So it's really the EU where we run into trouble.
Uh-oh, you're in the hot seat, Giuliana.
No, I think I got this question already. It is because of our regulations on customs. So certain data are protected because there are commercial interests behind, and also for our privacy laws. So and it's not something that can be disclosed by passing this legislation for one specific study or so. You can relaunch the question, but I know that we have a legal basis which is aiming at protecting the commercial interest and also the privacy of individuals. And you know that our privacy law is something that we are fighting a lot for. So we have to strike a balance somewhere for this data. But it could be that like clustered data without mentioning names could be extracted, but it would require checking with the responsible services in the European Commission, but there are those dealing with customs.
Unmuted, so I can say we're all going to have to go goodbye shortly. But I want to thank you all. This was fascinating, and just so everyone knows that I'm going to be continuing talking with Rick that we're also going to organize a couple of follow-up panels. I mean, want to dive a little deeper into some of the intricacies within China. It's complex everywhere, but it's I'm encouraged. I'm more encouraged than I thought I might have been to see some of the possibilities. And I want to thank you all again for coming, and make sure when this webinar is posted online that you can share it with everyone so they can hear all your great stories. So thank you again for coming, and I want to thank the audience when you eventually get to see us for watching. Good night. Good night. Good morning. Goodbye, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jennifer.